presiding judge a federal courtroom, and he ordered photographers taking pictures through the auditorium windows to knock it off. Due to a lack of space inside the real courtroom, the Civic Center will be used while attorneys attempt to narrow down the 120 potential jurors to the final 12. Among this pool of jurors was a son of the sheriff of Warren County. That sheriff once testified before the special federal grand jury that indicted Nixon. There was also one woman who said her children were good friends with Judge Nixon's children. Also today, a long list of possible witnesses was revealed. It includes Nixon's secretary, Betty Lou Watkins, and his former secretary, Alice James of Ocean Springs. Nixon's wife, Barbara, may testify. U.S. Attorney George Phillips, Mississippi Highway Patrol Chief George Saxon. Also, Neville Patterson, the Chief Justice of Mississippi's Supreme Court, Ernest Melvin, a former Harrison County Supervisor, U.S. Magistrate John Roper, and former Mississippi Bank head Pat McMullen. But before any of these people will testify, the jury, of course, must be selected. Of the 120 potential jurors here today, less than 20 were excused due to a scheduling conflict with their jobs or with their families. Those remaining will undergo more intense questioning, with questions about pretrial publicity surrounding the case and questions about whether they know any of the witnesses who are likely to testify at this trial. The jury selection process could continue all day tomorrow and possibly even longer than that. The building here has been reserved for use by the court through Thursday. From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
And joining us now is Dr. James Halsted. He's with USM. He's a lawyer and also is with the Criminal Justice Department at the university. And he's going to be with us for the next several weeks while the trial is underway, trying to give us an insight behind the scenes of some of the wheelings and dealings and power broker schemes in terms of legal efforts to maneuver the outcome of this case that will be going on. Welcome, Doctor. We're glad to have you with us. First of all, what was it like today? Who took command of the early jury selection process?
Well, the early jury selection process was taken charge by the clerks. They garnered everybody, and they gathered everyone up. They got them in proper order, and then finally Judge Meredith came in, and he took charge.
Now, what exactly was the judge looking for today in his beginnings, cross-examination or whatever of the jury?
Well, he was questioning the jury on general matters that would disqualify them for any jury, not just the Nixon jury. He was asking them if they had any kind of physical illness, for example, that they could not sit for 2 weeks or maybe 3 weweeks. He asked them if they had any business reasons that they could not possibly stay for the 2 or 3 week period, or personal reasons. That's when the lawyers got into play and they got to know a little bit more about the jury.
Now, when do the lawyers get their chance at bat in this?
Well, they got their chance a little bit today. They, when the jurors came up and said they could not sit for personal or business reasons, they got to ask them quite a bit about their own personal views on life, their own business inclinations, and that gave them a little idea the way they might go as a jury.
What do you think Nixon's defense strategy is going to be through his attorneys in selecting these jurors?
Well, I think he's going to try to get an intelligent jury. I think he's going to try to get a jury that respects authority. It appears by the witness list that he has a lot of character witnesses that says he's a good man and he's believable on the stand. And I think he's going to try to get a group of witnesses that maybe don't know that much about investments, that could understand his deal that he made as an ordinary investment as opposed to any kind of a gratuity.
Doctor, we thank you for being with us, and of course those are just some of the things we're going to be keeping an eye out now to see whether or not your predictions come true, and we hope to have you back in a day or two to give us some more insight.
It's a pleasure.
Appreciate it. And in regard to the trial, Walter Nixon Jr. is currently living in Ocean Springs, as many of you know, but he grew up in Biloxi. Karen Abernathy has this look at the judge's background.
Walter Nixon Jr. was born December 16, 1928, the son of former Harrison County Supervisor Walter Nixon Sr. and the former Hazel Kornman. Nixon attended the Notre Dame School for Boys, now known as Mercy Cross. While there, he participated in football and other extracurricular activities. After graduation, he was off to Louisiana State University, but finished his education at Tulane Law School, graduating with high honors in '51. He returned home to Biloxi, practicing law from '51 to '53 before joining the Air Force during the Korean conflict. He reopened his practice in March of '55, took part in civic affairs, serving as Biloxi's Chamber of Commerce president from '57 to '58. Senator James Eastland, who had ties with Nixon's father, and President Lyndon Johnson selected Nixon for the federal judgeship in May of '68. with swearing-in ceremonies on July 26th that year, making him the youngest federal judge in the country. In October of '81, the Reagan administration and Justice Department selected him to fill the Fifth Circuit vacancy, but Nixon turns down the opportunity. Less than 1 year later, the Supreme Court names Nixon Chief Judge for the Southern District.
I accept the responsibilities of Chief Judge and shall make every effort to discharge the duties thereof in the same conscientious, capable, and proficient manner as did my two predecessor Chief Judges.
The investigation leading up to today's trial began in July of '84. Months later, Nixon lands a special seat on a council for the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Since his indictment in August, Nixon has continued to work here at Federal Courthouse in Biloxi, handling administrative duties. Whether he returns to work here after the trial remains to be seen. But even if he's convicted as charged, that does not mean he'll lose his judgeship. The loss of that lifetime appointment will come only through his own resignation or congressional impeachment. Karen Abernathy, Newswatch 13.
Coming up next, the gubernatorial succession bill sails through the Senate. And
you can even get 7.9% APR on many selected models. Get an 86 Cavalier Coupe for just $149.89 a month, or a Celebrity 4-cylinder sedan for just $195.17 a month. You can even get a full-size C10 pickup for only $149.89 a month. We're exploding with savings right now at Cherry Lane Chevrolet, where you pay less in Pascagoula.
Cable TV, man.
Temperatures rising, starting to glow. It's a red hot winter on HBO. The Empire Strikes Back, Cotton Club. Feel the heat like never before. Passage to India, Starman. Cable's hot, there's never been more. It's a red hot winter. You can feel the glow. Get it now on cable and HBO.
You're watching WLOX TV 13. This is the 6 p.m. edition of Newswatch 13 with news anchor Jim Roberts, sports director A.J. Jardina, and meteorologist Joe Lazura.
Good evening. I'm Karen Abernathy. At this hour, the Harrison County Sheriff Department and a number of other agencies are conducting a gambling sweep across the county. Officials say so far 6 search warrants have been served at 4 businesses and 2 residences. Officers have confiscated cash, bookmaking sheets, parlay sheet records, and football poles. Long Beach and Bay St. Louis police are also participating in the raid. We have a reporter on the scene, and we'll have more on this at 10. For some time, the Jackson County District Attorney's Office has been investigating racketeering and corruption in that area. Tom Bagwell reports.
The investigation started in Jackson County, but DA Mike Moore now says he's traced the illegal activity through 4 counties.
Throughout Jackson County, throughout Harrison County, into Hancock County, and even over into Mobile, Alabama, Mobile County.
Just 2 weeks ago, officials picked up these machines in Pascagoula. But last night, investigators moved into Harrison County. It was about 10 o'clock last night when investigators came here to a mini warehouse in the back of Del Champs Plaza in North Biloxi. Then they opened up door number 26. And this is what they found: more gambling equipment, 10 electric slot machines, and 27 video machines.
These are the video poker machines that we've been investigating for the last 6 months, and slot machines, actual one-armed bandits. Actually, what we're investigating, rather than just gambling, is racketeering activities.
Moore says if you're not familiar with racketeering and how it works, you will be in the next several months. Tom Bagwell, Newswatch 13.
Meanwhile, the city of Biloxi is attempting to close down a lounge where officials say gambling is being conducted. Today, city attorneys went to court and were successful in obtaining a temporary injunction against K9, located on Calavet Street. City officials argued in court that betting slips, football forms, and other gambling paraphernalia have been found at the lounge. A hearing on whether the club should be closed permanently has been set for March 10th. A 17-year veteran of the Gulfport Police Department is on administrative leave tonight, facing charges of mistreating prisoners. Chuck Gillen appeared before an administrative board of the police department this afternoon to answer charges brought against him by Police Chief Haywood Hargrove. Gillen told Newswatch 13 he did not believe he used excessive force in handling prisoners. Gillen says politics may be involved in the matter. Chief Hargrove says he will issue a press release after he determines the facts in the case. Meanwhile, only 7 more people are needed to complete the 36-member jury pool in the Judge Walter Nixon trial. Ed Bryson reports from Hattiesburg.
For most of the potential jurors, it was another long day of waiting here in Hattiesburg. So far today, a Long Beach banker was excused after he said he thought Judge Nixon should be held to a higher standard of conduct than others, and a Jackson woman was excused after she said she believed that Nixon, quote, might be guilty. Also, a Purvis woman, Elizabeth Bickham, was excused after admitting she thought Nixon was, in her words, probably guilty. Bickham said it was difficult to understand how a man with his intelligence and education would not know the difference between an illegal gift and a legitimate investment. When she admitted to having already formed an opinion in the case, defense attorney Mike Fowler moved to excuse her immediately, saying, quote, if we spend even only 12 seconds on her, that's 12 seconds wasted. But prosecutor Reed Weingarten, who has objected to Fowler's lengthy interviews with jurors, said, I find it very interesting you're talking about wasting time. Once again, defense attorney Mike Fowler asked each juror if they believed they could decide what Judge Nixon's state of mind was. Fowler said that is the crux of this case. Fowler also asked each juror if they believed that a person, even a federal judge, could become a victim of circumstance. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning back at the federal courthouse for a rare Saturday session and for what in all likelihood will be the final day of jury selection in this trial. From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
And we turn now to our legal analyst, Dr. James Halsted. Dr. Halsted, as we told you earlier this week, will be with us throughout the Nixon trial. And Dr. Halsted, do you think that the questions defense lawyers are asking potential jurors now will affect the outcome of the trial?
Yes, that's true in almost every case. A lawyer begins arguing his case with the voir dire questions that they ask the jury before the trial even starts, and that's certainly true in the Nixon case.
Have you heard any questions in particular that Dr. Fowler seems to be emphasizing now?
Yeah, I see 2 questions. I see the first one, he continues to ask juror after juror after juror whether they will hold Nixon to the same standard of behavior that they will hold an ordinary citizen. And when they say yes to that, he has a follow-up saying that I make a salary, you make a salary, Judge Nixon makes a salary, I make investments for my salary, you may make those investments. Does Judge Nixon have the right to make an investment? And when they say yes, he's laid the ground for his argument.
Well, have these questions given you any idea as to the defense strategy?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, they have. Those plus the witness list, plus a remark he made to Ed Bryson yesterday when he said that there was a symmetry among the prosecution witnesses.
So what does all this tell you about the strategy overall of the defense trial?
I think that the lawyer, Mr. Fowler, is going to defend Judge Nixon in the following manner. I think he's going to admit that Nixon purchased the oil leases for $9,500, but what he is going to contest was the gratuitous intent that the state alleges that he had when he made those oil leases. The state will produce 4 or 5 witnesses which state through direct or indirect evidence that Nixon did have a gratuitous intent, and this is where the symmetry comes in. The defense will say that these witnesses are not believable because all of them have had a felony conviction or they have plea bargained their, a severe sentence down to a light sentence. I also see the strategy of the defense as bringing everyone involved in the Drew Fairchild case to come forward, judges, prosecutors, and so forth, and show that there was no influence in the Drew Fairchild case. Combine that with the fact that you've got outstanding citizens throughout Mississippi saying that Judge Nixon is very believable and they're going to testify as character witnesses, and you don't put character witnesses on the stand unless the judge himself takes a stand, Judge Nixon. He will testify that he made an ordinary investment. So all of that together ties up into 2 propositions. Number one, who do you want to believe? A man with an impeccable reputation like Nixon versus the prosecution witnesses who are all convicted felons. And secondly, if he's guilty of influence peddling, why was there no influence? That's going to be the strategy of the case as I read it right now.
Okay, well, thanks for your comments. And jury selection continues tomorrow, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And coming up, layoffs at Ingalls, and a move is underway in the legislature to reduce the power of Lieutenant Governor Brad Dye.
Bag. Don't wait her king combo today.
He has felt better in his life when asked about his recovery from the flu. In his opening arguments, Weingarten said the issue at this trial will be whether the government's witnesses are telling the truth now. Weingarten said Bud Holmes, Wiley Fairchild, and Drew Fairchild and other witnesses were not, quote, selected out of a church choir, but the question is, said Weingarten, do they have a motive to lie now? He says they lied in the past only to protect themselves and to protect Judge Nixon. Weingarten said Nixon used his office to get his hands on some of the wealth of Wiley Fairchild, and he called the oil and gas lease transfer a sweetheart deal that continues to make Nixon richer. Defense attorney Mike Fowler said the federal government has ignored their own witnesses' motive to lie. Fowler said Nixon had no motive to lie to the grand jury since he had done nothing improper. Fowler says Nixon's gas lease deal with Wiley Fairchild was a legitimate investment that Nixon made to help him finance his children's education. Also in his opening arguments, Fowler said that the oil and gas leases were indeed backdated, but that it was only because of a technical error in the documents themselves, that there was nothing improper about it at all. Fowler said Wiley Fairchild agreed to loan Nixon the money for those leases so that the judge wouldn't have to go to a bank and borrow the money. And finally, Fowler said all of these arrangements for the sale of these oil and gas leases were completed long before Drew Fairchild ever got in trouble with the law. Fowler said the government's witness Bud Holmes told self-serving lies to the grand jury and is, quote, a match for Judas Iscariot. In testimony this afternoon, Drew Fairchild explained the round and about road his marijuana case traveled in federal and state courts. Defense attorney Mike Fowler asked, did Nixon have anything to do with any of those offenses? And Drew Fairchild said no. From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
We turn now to our legal analyst, Dr. James Halsted. Dr. Halsted, what is the significance of these opening arguments presented today?
Well, this gives the lawyers an opportunity to kind of put the whole picture of their case in front of the jury. As they hear the evidence, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. They'll only get a piece of the jigsaw puzzle and then another piece. But by presenting an opening argument, they show the jury the entire jigsaw puzzle as made, so the jury can anticipate what's going on.
So very important in the long outcome of the case.
I think it's very important.
How good a job did they do?
Well, I think we have two thoroughbreds in the courtroom, Jim. You've got the Justice Department certainly does not have to hang their head with Reed Weingarten. He is excellent. And the defense attorney, Mr. Fowler, is magnificent.
After listening to the opening arguments, what can we expect in the trial as it goes along for the main points?
Well, in my notes, I uncovered about 75 contradictions between what the defense said they were going to do and what the prosecution said they were going to do. But there are basically 6 that I think the entire case is going to resolve around. The first 3 involve the oil lease purchase. The first one was that it seems both sides agree that Judge Nixon tried to contact Mr. Fairchild to buy the leases. The defense, however, in 79, way before the Drew Fairchild bust. The prosecution said it happened afterwards. That's the first thing they're going to disagree upon. The second thing is that they both seem to agree that the deeds were backdated. Yet what they disagree is the intent of Nixon when they were backdated. The prosecution said that Nixon demanded it so it would look like he purchased it before the Drew Fairchild incident occurred. Judge Nixon's lawyer, on the other hand, said that this was the request of Carol Ingram and that there was a technical error, there wasn't enough acreage mentioned on it, and that the oral agreement had actually happened a year before, so why not backdate the deeds to when the agreement actually took place? The third area of contingency, as I see around the deed, is when Nixon accepted the deeds. The prosecution says that he accepted them with a gratuitous intent. That is, he knew he received something for free as the result of his office. Now, on the other hand, Judge Nixon has contended it's an ordinary investment. He said he will produce evidence to show that this was the fair market value for these deeds. He will produce evidence to show it was a speculative venture, that they weren't even online yet with the oil wells, and that, in fact, one of the oil wells didn't produce at all, and it was a bad speculation as far as that's concerned. Okay, the next area of controversy surrounds a telephone call that all sides agree took place at Bud Holmes' house with Nixon present with Holmes to Wiley Fairchild. The first part of that controversy is this. It is Wiley Fairchild contacting Judge Nixon. They both agree that it happened. However, the prosecution said that Fairchild contacted Nixon in order to see if he could influence Holmes.
And how about
the defense, on the other hand, stated that the reason that Judge Nixon was in town, it was the first time he'd met Fairchild, he wanted to talk to him about his basic business deal, and that Fairchild accused Holmes of blackmailing him. And with this kind of slander, he wanted to go out to his house where he was going anyway and to try to straighten the whole thing out.
So at least several of the major points where we're going to see some confrontation, conflict already existing, and now how they're all resolved, obviously the outcome of the case is going to hinge on that.
Exactly. It's what the jury believes is going to
Doctor,
happen.
we thank you again for being with us. We look forward to having you back again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And elsewhere in the...
Amazing offer, a juicy flame broiled Whopper. But that's not all. Large order of golden fries. But wait, Herb, there's more. An ice cold soft drink, all for one special price. That's right, Herb, one special price. Try to make this at home, you could pay 3 times as much. Plus, Act Now will throw in this handy bag. Don't wait, Herb. Order your King Combo today. Here's how.
Go to Burger King and say, I want the King Combo. That's I want the King Combo.
WLOX TV 13, Biloxi, Gulfport, Pascagoula.
This is the 6 p.m. edition of Newswatch 13 with news anchor Jim Roberts, sports director A.J. Jardina, and meteorologist Joe Lazura.
Good evening. Former Forest County District Attorney Bud Holmes was on the stand for the entire day at the trial of U.S. District Judge Walter Nixon Jr. today, as the defense repeatedly tried to punch holes in his story about the date and the content of an alleged telephone call made from his farm. Ed Bryson has details.
Bud Holmes testified that after the FBI investigation began, Nixon wanted to know if that phone call from Holmes' farm had been taped. Holmes said later on Nixon acted like he didn't know anything about the phone call, and once at a party, Nixon said, "I don't know why you picked up the phone and called Wiley Fairchild." Holmes says it was Nixon who made the phone call. On cross-examination, Holmes admitted that part of the reason he agreed to prosecute Drew Fairchild to transfer that case from federal court to state court was that he, Holmes, thought that that might help his friend Bill Porter, who was Drew Fairchild's attorney, get paid for his legal services to Drew. Holmes also admitted that federal prosecutors offered not to indict him if he would, quote, give them Judge Nixon. But Holmes said he didn't give the federal government information about Nixon after he pleaded guilty than they already had. Defense attorney Mike Fowler asked many questions about the date of the much-talked-about phone call from Holmes' farm. Holmes insisted that the call was made in 1982 before Drew Fairchild's case was passed to the inactive file. In fact, on May 14, 1982. Fowler suggested that since Nixon was in court in Biloxi that day, it was highly unlikely that he drove to Hattiesburg at all on May 14th. Fowler said, "I'm suggesting that it really happened in 1983, which was after Drew's case was passed to the file. I'm suggesting that you're lying about it." Fowler further suggested that not only was Holmes lying, he was lying to save himself at the expense of his friend Walter Nixon. Holmes said, "I came here to tell the truth." From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
Dr. James Halsted is with us once again tonight to wrap up this week's chain of events. Dr. Halsted, welcome. Good to have you with us again.
Good to be here.
Basically, Bud Holmes, prosecution witness again, what do you think was the most damaging testimony for Judge Nixon that came from him today?
Well, he was damaging in the sense that he testified that Judge Nixon came to see him and drove out to his farm, and while they were in the car, that Judge Nixon said to he, Holmes, Wiley asked me to put in a good word for Drew. They later went out to the farm, and at this point, Holmes suggested he drop Drew's case from the file, and then Nixon went up and called Wiley Fairchild and told him about it.
But it wasn't all gloom and doom for Judge Nixon by any stretch of the imagination today. The defense scored some points with Holmes.
Sure did. The defense scored a lot of points. The main point that I saw was the fact that Holmes said categorically that in no way did Judge Nixon influence him whatsoever in his handling of the Drew Fairchild case.
Now, I don't understand how the prosecution could go about calling Holmes and know that he was going to testify to this.
Well, I think that it hurt their case in one way, but also it helped their case in the sense that Judge Nixon is charged with perjury. He said that he never talked with Holmes about the Drew Fairchild case, and certainly that aspect of the case was promoted by his testimony.
Are we likely to see anything in the future from Holmes any more damaging than came out today?
No, I think not.
The party's over for that one. Let's go back a day to Wiley Fairchild. Fowler was, if I can use the term, almost brutal in assessing the situation in terms of the prosecution bringing Wiley Fairchild in. A man in his 70s, he said. He called this situation pathetic. Wiley Fairchild turned out to be a big disappointment for the prosecution.
Indeed, he did. He was confused often. He made contradictory statements. but I think most of all, he made some damaging statements to two of the prosecution's charges. Number one, he said categorically time and time again that his oil deal with Judge Nixon had absolutely nothing to do with Drew's case. Secondly, he admitted that he made 1,000% profit on the oil deal, which doesn't sound like a gratuity. And thirdly, he was never sure when the telephone call from the farmhouse came out. At one time he admitted it was in '83 after the cases were passed to the file. Another time he said, no, it was before the case was passed to the file. So he was very uncertain in that sense.
Very quickly, if we had a judge right now, who do you think is ahead, the defense or the prosecution?
I think the defense has to be very happy with where the case is right now, considering only prosecution witnesses has testified. They haven't even had a chance to present their case yet, and they're looking pretty good.
Dr. Halsted, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
And elsewhere...
Roberts, Sports Director A.J. Jardina, and meteorologist Joe Lazura.
Good evening. I'm Jim Roberts. 8 people were killed this afternoon in a blaze which swept through the Crystal Springs furniture store. Fire officials there say the blaze in the Watkins Furniture Company followed an explosion. They don't know what caused that. Fire units from Copiah and Hinds County joined the Crystal Springs Department to battle the flames. We'll have more on the story tonight at 10. The defense has begun presenting its witnesses now in the trial of federal judge Walter Nixon, Jr. of Ocean Springs. This morning, presiding judge James Meredith denied a defense motion for a not guilty verdict on all 4 charges after the prosecution rested its case. Ed Bryson reports from Hattiesburg.
In arguing for a directed verdict of not guilty, defense attorney Mike Fowler said it was inconceivable that the illegal gratuity charge should even be before the court. Fowler said not a single fact, not a single shred of evidence had been presented that proves Nixon had anything in mind other than a legitimate investment when he received oil and gas wells from Wiley Fairchild. As for the perjury charges, Fowler said that even the government's own witnesses, Bud Holmes and Wiley Fairchild, said they did not discuss the Drew Fairchild case. Fowler said Nixon merely passed on a message from Wiley Fairchild to Bud Holmes. Prosecutor Reed Weingarten said it is clear that Wiley Fairchild wanted help down the road when he made the oil and gas deal with Judge Nixon, and that Fairchild was plenty fed up with his son Drew's case. Weingarten said, what was Nixon doing putting in a good word for Drew Fairchild to District Attorney Bud Holmes? What was the point if it was not to influence the case? Weingarten said, what obligation was there for Nixon to put in a good word for a drug smuggler he never knew? Weingarten, the illegal gratuity law does not require proof of a specific link between Drew Fairchild's case and the oil and gas deal. He said all we need to prove is that Nixon accepted the leases because he was a federal judge. This afternoon, the defense called the current district attorney for Forest County, Glenn White. White testified that Bud Holmes wanted to pass Drew Fairchild's case to the file because he had promised that to Fairchild's attorney, Bill Porter. White said that later on, Holmes told him that there were other reasons for passing the case to the file, namely that he had talked to Judge Nixon about it. Other defense witnesses today included 2 circuit court judges and an assistant district attorney who at various times handled various aspects of Drew Fairchild's case. Defense attorney Mike Fowler still won't say whether or not Judge Nixon will testify in his own defense later on. From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
It has indeed been an intriguing trial so far. Dr. James M.'s Criminal Justice Department why do you think the judge didn't dismiss the charges or order a directed verdict or whatever the terminology is now on the taking of those leases, since it's pretty well been established by both defense and prosecution witnesses that those were given to the judge well before the Fairchild case?
Yes, all the major witnesses in the case, with the exception of Skip Jarvis, have said that the deal went down in 1979 or 1980, 5 months before the plane ever came down with the drugs. And even Skip Jarvis admitted if that were true, then the oil deal would have nothing to do whatsoever with the Drew Fairchild case.
So why do you suppose the judge didn't order a directed verdict on that?
My guess is his instructions in law are that if he finds any evidence upon which a reasonable jury might find the defendant guilty, then he should refuse to dismiss. And apparently he has found some evidence that he thought a reasonable jury might find the judge guilty on.
I can't help but wonder whether or not there's a little public relations involved here, too. After all, this is a federal judge sitting on a trial of a federal judge, and it might not look too good if he were to dismiss it.
Yeah, you've got one judge charged with corruption. It would look a little strange, I might add, if another judge dismisses the case.
How about Carol Ingram, that mystery witness that both sides, the defense and the prosecution, were claiming would be their star witness? Seems incongruous.
And it turned out to be true. I've never seen anything like it. He was a star witness for the prosecution, and he was a star witness for the defense. For the prosecution, apparently everyone talked to him about that farm phone call that night. Judge Nixon talked to him and acknowledged that he had gone out to the farm on the request of Wiley Fairchild to talk to Holmes about Drew's case. Wiley Fairchild talked to Carol Ingram and told him essentially the same thing, and Bud Holmes talked to Carol Ingram and told him essentially the same thing. In that sense, he was very, very devastating a witness for the prosecution. On the other hand, he was the alleged go-between man, and the oil ever came down in that plane and that drug bust.
All right, the defense's crack at this now. What stars are we going to see in the future on all that?
That's a very good question. I'm anxious to see. The first people they're putting in there is everybody that handled the Drew Child case, who are testifying essentially that there was nothing unusual that happened to the case.
So a string of supporting witnesses then in that area.
That's right.
All right. Doctor, we thank you. We wish we had more time to talk with you, but we're out of it for today, and we invite you back.
I'll be back.
And we're going to turn to some other areas in the news tonight as well. Mississippi veterans...
And that's how Forrest General Hospital built its complete program of heart care. Now, with a highly skilled and experienced surgical team, Forrest General can provide total treatment of heart disease, including bypass surgery. That's a major step forward for Forrest General, and for you. For complete heart care, now you have a choice in South Mississippi. Forrest General Hospital, Hattiesburg.
WLOX TV 13, Biloxi, Gulfport, Pascagoula.
This is the 6 p.m. edition of Newswatch 13 with news anchor Jim Roberts, sports director A.J. Jardina, and meteorologist Joe Lazura.
Good evening. I'm Jim Roberts. After 1 week of jury selection and 2 full weeks of testimony, the trial of Judge Walter Nixon Jr. is coming to an end. The 7-man, 5-woman jury will begin tomorrow to try to decide if Nixon is guilty or innocent. Reports on Nixon's final day on the witness stand.
The last section of cross-examination of Judge Nixon was intense. Prosecutor Reed Weingarten asked Nixon why he never contacted the federal government to say that telephone call incident was only a terrible misunderstanding. Nixon said, "If you had wanted me to come back to the grand jury, you could have subpoenaed me. You didn't do that because you were intent on indicting me come hell or high water." Weingarten, "Did you volunteer to come back and explain?" Nixon said, "No." Weingarten said, "And yet after you knew Bud Holmes pleaded guilty to lying to the grand jury for covering up that phone call, your attorney went to Washington to the Justice Department on several occasions." Nixon agreed. Moving on, Weingarten asked, would it be proper for a federal judge to influence a state prosecutor to go easy on a drug smuggler because the judge had a business relationship with the smuggler's father? Defense attorney Mike Fowler objected, saying, "Judge, what does this have to do with this case? It can't be that it's a description of the crime that is alleged." Weingarten shot back, "Everything, Your Honor." Weingarten asked the question again, would that be proper? Nixon, "Is that a hypothetical question?" Weingarten, "Is it, Judge? Isn't that exactly what you did in this case?" Despite more objections from Fowler, Nixon answered, "You know I didn't. That is a lie." Several rebuttal witnesses were seen at the courthouse today, including Bud Holmes' girlfriend, Marcia Bailey. But the prosecution did not call any rebuttal witnesses to the stand, and both sides rested their cases after the lunch break. Attorneys will spend the afternoon in chambers with Judge Meredith arguing over the instructions for the jury. These instructions are crucial because they will be the exact and specific explanation of what an illegal gratuity really is. And clearly the attorneys on the opposing sides of this case have very different ideas about that. Closing arguments will begin in the morning, and after that, the jury will begin its deliberations. From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
And Dr. James Halsted joins us once again for an overview of what's been happening so far in the trial. I guess it's all over except for the shouting, if there's going to be any, tomorrow among those jury members when they finally get into the jury room.
Well, I still think closing arguments are very, very important, and I think both men are gearing up, both Mr. Weingarten and Mr. Fowler, to give one last crack at the jury to argue their case.
Let's step back for just a second. How strong was Weingarten in the final day of talking to Nixon today? That's obviously going to leave an impression, a strong impression on the jury's mind.
Well, Weingarten was cross-examining Nixon, I think, to his fullest extent. I don't think he made much headway with Nixon. He made about 3 good points that I think are worth mentioning. He first of all asked Nixon why he never mentioned the farmhouse when he testified to the grand jury, and Nixon replied because he was never asked about it, and his attorney advised him that he should only answer specific questions. He also said that, why didn't you mention anything about backdating the deed? And he did. Nixon said, I did mention something about it. I couldn't remember exactly what it was, but I remember there was something unorthodox about the deal. The third thing I thought that Weingarten did was effective, he said, do you think someone like you or I could call up Wiley Fairchild and buy an oil deal? Which is kind of what Nixon said he did. And Nixon replied, said, I don't know. You'll have to ask Wiley Fairchild.
All right. What are the strongest points you see both sides trying to make tomorrow in their closing statements or arguments?
Well, I think they're going to try to argue the evidence that each of them have to their theory of the case. They're going to, tonight, the judge has determined what an illegal gratuity is, and he will instruct the jury tomorrow exactly what that definition is. Both of them will look at the evidence and try to conform their evidence to the definition of an illegal gratuity.
Let me put you on the spot. How long do you think it'll take the jury to reach a verdict, and do you have any feel for the jury at this point? Which way do you think they'll go?
Well, lawyers, as a matter of law, are incompetent to sit on juries. We can't do it. It's against the law. Secondly, I don't know a single lawyer that can predict a jury. I, for one, am terrible at predicting juries. I can never figure out the way they think. I can tell you the way I think that I would vote in the case, but I can't tell you, I don't think I'd be fair if I could predict this jury.
How would you vote?
If I were on the jury, I would vote not guilty on all 4 counts.
And how long do you think it will take for this jury perhaps to reach some kind of an opinion?
If they're going to come back with an acquittal, I think they'll come back within 3 hours.
So if we don't see him in 3 hours, we can begin thinking there might be trouble ahead for Judge Nixon.
If I were Judge Nixon and they had not come back in 3 hours, I would start worrying.
Thank you, Dr. Halsted, for joining us once again. Elsewhere in the news tonight...
Marcia Hill, sportscaster Robin Roberts, and meteorologist Mike Reeder.
Good evening. Topping the news tonight, after 15 and a half hours of deliberation, the jury has reached a verdict in the trial of U.S. Judge Walter Nixon. Ed Bryson joins us live by phone with the latest. Ed, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, Marcia.
What is happening up there tonight?
Marcia, it is a sad night here in federal court in Hattiesburg. Nixon was, in a word, devastated by the verdict. When Judge James Meredith read not guilty on the first 2 counts, the illegal gratuity charge and 1 perjury charge, defense attorney Mike Fowler put his arm around his client, obviously hoping for more good news, and then guilty as charged was read on the last 2 counts. Judge Nixon cried and looked over at his family, who also cried. He put his head down on the table. Judge Meredith said that the family would have to be quiet or leave the courtroom. The jury was polled individually. Some had tears in their eyes, and then, flanked on each side by his attorneys, Nixon walked to the courtroom door, his legs unable to carry his weight at one point. And for the first time ever, a sitting U.S. District Judge has been found guilty after one trial. He was found guilty of perjury, 2 counts. 1, for lying to the federal grand jury when he denied discussing the Drew Fairchild case with Bud Holmes, and 2, for lying to the grand jury when he denied having anything to do with the Drew Fairchild case, and when he said, quote, I never talked to anyone, state or federal, prosecutor or judge, in any way influenced anybody. An angry defense attorney, Mike Fowler, said he would appeal. He said the jury's verdict was based on perjured testimony from Bud Holmes. He said he was shocked by the verdict. Prosecutor Reed Weingarten said, quote, nobody in the Department of Justice is going to celebrate this. We are satisfied that the case had to be brought, and we are satisfied that justice has been done. Nixon left the courthouse here about a half hour ago with his family. He thanked the few members of the media still here for their fair coverage. Nixon faces a maximum sentence of 5 years for each of the 2 perjury charges, plus $20,000 in fines. While his case is on appeal, he will remain a federal judge unless Congress acts to impeach him or, of course, if he resigns. He would encourage Nixon to continue to work handling administrative duties only at federal court in Biloxi while the case is under appeal, just as Nixon has done since he was indicted on August 29th of last year. Judge Nixon was appointed to the bench in 1968 by President Lyndon Johnson upon the recommendation of Senator James Eastland. Nixon's father was a friend and supporter of Eastland. And Nixon himself said in his acceptance speech in 1968, quote, that often the popular decision is not the correct decision, but that this court will always render justice without favoritism. He said, the floor of this court shall always be level for all men of all walks of life, and that is clearly something that the 7 men and 5 women who served on this jury believe. Marcia.
So, Ed, of course, it's all over now then, and except for the appeal, which Nixon's attorney says will definitely come later on.
The appeal will definitely come. There's no way. Fowler said he had no idea how long that process would take.
Okay, Ed, thank you so much for staying up there all this time. I know it's been a long day, and I know you'll be glad to come home, and we're glad that you've kept us in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And now we're going to turn for an analysis of the trial. We're going to turn to Dr. James Halsted. He's joining us for an analysis of the trial's outcome. And Dr. Halsted is here with us now. Dr. Halsted, let me ask you, first of all, you've been sitting in with us during the whole tenure of this trial, giving us your opinion, your political expertise. What was your first impression of this verdict?
Well, I thought the verdict was somewhat paradoxical. It seemed to be an illogical verdict to me in the beginning, even though when I reflected back on it, I understand how the jury came to the result. Can I explain myself?
Sure.
The four charges against Walter Nixon were basically four events, one following each other in sequence logically. The first event was the illegal gratuity. He pays supposedly too little for the oil wells. This with Wiley Fairchild, in which the government alleges that Fairchild asks Nixon to help his kid out. After that, that supposedly leads to the third event, which is Nixon talking to Bud Holmes, according to the government, asking him to put in a good word for Drew Fairchild, which leads to the fourth event, Bud Holmes passing the case to the file. Now, in review, only the first event, as an event, is illegal, the gratuity. There's nothing wrong with Nixon talking to Fairchild. There's nothing about the case. There is nothing wrong with him talking to Holmes about the case. And passing a case to the files has no legal effect whatsoever. That's just an administrative move. So substantively, the last three charges, there was nothing illegal about them. What he was charged with is he was asked about those events in the grand jury, and they said that he lied in his answers. The jury comes back on the first event, says not guilty. He's not guilty at all of accepting an illegal gratuity, which leads to the second event. They said he's not guilty when he said, I never discussed the case with Wiley Fairchild. Apparently the jury believes he never did discuss the case with Wiley Fairchild. But then they come back and find that he was guilty when he said, I never discussed the case with Bud Holmes. They apparently found he did, even though the event leading to it they found that he didn't do. And fourthly, they found him guilty of saying, I never tried to influence the case, and they found that he did.
As we just heard from Ed Bryson, Mike Fowler, Nixon's attorney, says that his client is not going to be hearing any cases from the bench, but he's not going to step aside either. Could he legally hear cases if he chose to do so?
Yes, he sure can. There's only two ways a federal judge can be removed from office. That's to be either resign, and obviously Mike Fowler says he's not going to do that, or he has to be impeached by Congress.
Okay, let's talk about the Nixon is the third federal judge to go to trial on charges, but he's only the second to be convicted. Were you surprised with that? It's obviously not a common practice.
No, federal judges have one of the highest statuses in this country. When I was in law school, I was told that the closest thing the United States has to a king is a federal judge. They are very, very highly revered, and yes, it's very unusual for a federal judge to be convicted.
Do you think that the 15.5 hours that the jury deliberated, was that a normal time, if that's the word I can use?
Well, considering the inconsistency of their verdict, you know, that they say in one half he's innocent of events that should have logically led to the second half, I can see why they took that long to come out with that verdict.
What do you think this is going to mean for Nixon's reputation and his career? What's it going to do to him?
Well, I think it's not going to be over until the appeal. You know, I would feel good about that, but it's going to be devastating to his career. My guess is if he does not win an appeal, I would guess that he would probably resign from office. He faces being disbarred by the state. It is absolutely devastating, not to mention that, in fact, that he may go to jail.
Okay. Well, Dr. Halsted, thank you so much for joining us and coming down in this weather, I know, driving from Hattiesburg. Thanks so much, and have a safe drive home, okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Reporter Mike Hyde is also in Hattiesburg this evening, and he's been talking to some of the jurors about their decision. He now joins us on the phone for a report. Mike, can you hear us?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, Mike, I understand you've been talking to some of the jurors in the trial, particularly the jury foreman. What does he have to say?
Marcia, he's a veteran of 17 appearances of this nature on a jury panel, but this is his first as the foreman. He says it was quite an emotionally harrowing experience. He's emotionally spent, as are other members of the jury that we talked with this evening. But he emphasized the fact that there was unanimity from the beginning. It's simply that they wanted to go through the charges one by one, and of course you had a number of counts originally handed down in the indictments. And he said it was simply a process of separating the fact from the fiction, going through it so carefully, although he said they didn't spend any extra time on the case, considering that a public figure of Judge Nixon's stature was involved. They vowed from the beginning that they would treat him as they would any other common citizen of the state of Mississippi. He said that he is glad it's over, obviously, as are all of the other jurors, but he said that it was an experience which enriched him and certainly contributed to his 60 years on the face of the earth. The jury, as you know, was an older jury. He was perhaps one of the more senior members. And he said that in general, he is quite pleased with the outcome. He's satisfied with the verdict, and he is extremely satisfied with the way in which the jury went about their duties.
Mike, was this a unanimous, did he say, was this a unanimous vote by the jury to take this action against Judge Nixon?
He said that he did not want to go into particulars of the voting and how the decisions were arrived at. He simply emphasized the fact that the jury was extremely satisfied, and he said this as a unit. He meant to indicate, I think, or to imply to us here, that the jury as a whole, each member was collectively satisfied with the outcome.
All right, Mike, thank you so much for calling in, and we'll be looking forward to future reports from you. Thanks, Mike.
Yes, indeed, Marcia.
And that was reporter Mike Hyde, who's also in Hattiesburg this evening.
Yes, let Ed Saylor, Pontiac, Buick, GMC Trucks, and North Biloxi cut your new car payments and guarantee the value of your new car in writing for when you trade it in 4 years from now. You own the car, not lease it, and you get all the advantages of ownership. Only your car payments are much less than most dealers charge for the same price car. Come to Ed Saylor, Pontiac, Buick, GMC Trucks, and the Auto Mall Parkway in North Biloxi this week and pick out your beautiful new car and tell us to cut your payments.
Kathleen had always been a pillar of strength, saw her 3 children grow up, get married, and she loved the grandchildren. But after Kathleen's husband died, she withdrew, became old almost overnight. Her son and his wife did their best, but they were afraid to leave her alone. Then someone told them about Gulf Oaks in Biloxi, with the professional help Kathleen needed. Now Kathleen is on top of her problems, her hopelessness, and frankly is just too busy to worry about growing old.
Gulf Oaks, where professionals can help you put your life back together again.
Hundreds of new Pontiac buyers have already saved thousands with 7.9% GMAC financing.
But time is running out at your Performance Pontiac dealers.
7.9% financing ends February 22nd on all these new 86 Pontiacs.
Fieros, Sunbirds, Grand Prix, Bonnevils, and Pontiac 6000s with 2.5-liter engines.
If you want to save up to $1,700 in finance charges, hurry, buy now.
At Burt Allen Pontiac, Ed Saylor Pontiac, Schubert Pontiac, and Escudet Pontiac.
WLOX TV 13, Biloxi, Gulfport, Pascagoula.
This is the 5 p.m. edition of Newswatch 13 with news anchor Dave Elliott, sportscaster Robin Roberts, and meteorologist Joe Lazura.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 5 o'clock edition of Newswatch 13. I'm Dave Elliott. The attorney for federal Judge Walter Nixon is now asking for a new trial following last night's guilty verdict. However, Mike Faher says if he doesn't get a new trial, the case still won't be over. He says he will appeal to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans. Ed Bryson reports on last night's verdict.
57-year-old Walter Nixon Jr. was, in a word, devastated by the verdict. When Judge James Meredith read not guilty on the first 2 counts, the illegal gratuity and 1 perjury charge, defense attorney Mike Faher put his arm around his client, obviously hoping for more good news. But then, guilty as charged was read on the last 2 counts. Judge Nixon cried, looked over at his family, who also cried loudly. He put his head down on the table. Judge Meredith said the family would have to be quiet or leave the courtroom. The jury was then polled individually. Some had tears in their eyes, and then, with his attorneys on each side of him, Nixon walked to the courtroom door, his legs unable to carry his weight at one point. For the first time in U.S. history, a sitting federal judge was found guilty after 1 trial, guilty of 2 counts of perjury, 1 for lying to the grand jury when he denied discussing Drew Fairchild's case with Bud Holmes, and for lying to the grand jury when he denied having anything whatsoever to do with Drew Fairchild's case. Defense attorney Mike Faher said he was shocked by the verdict. He said he would appeal.
I do not know how anyone can understand a verdict in which the only underlying wrongdoing the man is totally acquitted of. I'm saddened by the verdict because I think that an excellent jurist stands here convicted of something that he had never done. I think he is a victim of circumstance. I think the press in all candor is most likely as surprised at this verdict as I am.
Prosecutor Reed Weingarten said this is not a happy moment for anyone.
Nobody's going to celebrate about this verdict. It's an unhappy event. Nevertheless, we're satisfied that the case had to be brought, and we're satisfied justice was done.
Nixon faces a maximum sentence of 5 years for each of the 2 perjury charges, plus $20,000 in fines. Nixon will remain a federal judge despite his conviction unless the United States Congress acts to impeach him, or, of course, should he resign. His attorney, however, says he will encourage Nixon to continue to work, handling administrative duties only at federal court in Biloxi. Nixon is scheduled to be sentenced on March 31st. From Hattiesburg, I'm Ed Bryson, Newswatch 13.
Joining us now for an analysis of last night's verdict is Dr. James Halsted, a law professor up at USM. Talking with him is WLOX anchor Jim Roberts. Gentlemen.
Thank you, David. Dr. Halsted, will a federal judge go to prison?
I think there's an excellent chance that he will get a prison sentence.
Why is that? Why not? I mean, his career will have been devastated if he doesn't win this on appeal. How much punishment has to be brought to bear, and why would a prison term be brought in this case?
Well, it authorizes a 10-year prison term, and he was placed in a high degree of public trust. I think the public would lose confidence if someone placed in that high of trust did not receive some kind of jail time.
Do you feel he should get a prison sentence?
Based on the conviction, I think the conviction warrants jail sentence.
You predicted an across-the-board acquittal. What was your reaction to what happened last night, and why do you think he turned out to be wrong?
Well, I was right on the first part in the sense that they found he was not corrupted in office. As a matter of fact, the findings of the jury was that everything he was investigated for by the grand jury, he was innocent. The only thing he was guilty of was the lying to the grand jury.
Why do you think the jury saw it that way?
I think Carol Ingram's testimony more than anything else.
Do you think that Nixon stands any chance of winning on appeal? Now, when he appeals, he will ultimately appeal to 3 judges. What do you think the politics or the dynamics of that will be?
Well, you don't know. You hope that they will be fair, they will listen to the facts, and if there was error at the trial, that they will reverse and grant a new trial, and if not, uphold the conviction.
Come on now. I mean, we're talking about judges who are intimately aware of the politics of this situation, judges deciding whether or not a judge is or is not guilty. Won't there be an increased sensitivity there on their part?
Sure there will. They'll look at it very carefully, but these are some of the finest citizens in the United States. I think they'll be fair.
Won't it look bad if the jury ruling is overturned by those judges? Do you think people will accept that?
Well, it won't be overturned. The best he can hope is a retrial, and he'll just start all over again. So it's not like he'll walk free if he wins on appeal.
Were you surprised by the way Nixon took the news that he was guilty?
I think the man in his own heart believed he was innocent. I thought he had won the case. And so, no, his reaction did not surprise me.
How about the federal court system? Do you think it's better off for Judge Nixon having been found guilty?
That's a tough one, Jim. You had a great jurist down here, a man whose legal mind everyone respected, a man who, by his deportment on the bench, made Southern Mississippi proud. We've lost a great jurist.
Why do you think he lied to the grand jury?
If he did lie, my guess is he did not know what the investigation was about, and he may have qualified an answer. I don't know. When you're on the spot like that, you get a little bit paranoid, and maybe you trip around the truth. I don't know why he lied.
One very last fast question. His retirement. He's 4 years away from that. Is there any way through the appeals process he can drag it out long enough where he'll qualify for retirement in spite of this?
Well, technically, he can appeal his case all the way to the Supreme Court, and as you know, that takes quite a long time. Yes, he could drag it out that long.
Dr. Halsted, again, we thank you for being with us and giving us your views into this case.
Thank you, Jim.
David, back to you.
Thanks, Jim. Governor Bill Elaine has vetoed a bill that would take $10 million away from the Highway Department. The governor,
Ted Bundy, will live or die.